Welcome into the install with Greg Cosell of NFL Films. Preseason done. Exhibition games are over. We are now on to the regular season for Tennessee. That's week one in New Orleans. For Greg, it's every team all over the place, and it means the NFL
Buck, you got
matchup
to be
show is
careful.
coming back.
The commissioner would not like to hear you say exhibition games. They are preseason games.
Oh, is exhibition is that a
Exhibition
taboo?
is a bad word. It's preseason.
Whatever it is, it's over. and we're happy for it because that means regular season football.
I share your sentiment, my friend. I share your sentiment.
I knew that you would. So now we can start to talk about matchups, and obviously we'll have a podcast between now and week one to go through some games. The matchup show, of course, with Greg and Darius Butler and Sal Powell back in action right around the corner as well. You can check that out on ESPN, ESPN Plus, set your DVRs. Great resource for you throughout the course of the football season. But Greg, we have roster cut down days and, roster transactions all over the place. The biggest one for Tennessee so far is Kyle Phillips placed on injured reserve. They expect him back. It's an MCL injury. But right now it looks like he's gonna miss at least the first 4 games.
Yeah, and I was sorry to see that, Buck, because, as you and I have discussed in the past, I really liked him coming out of college. He lost his first year last year. I think, as you and I both know, that if he was not injured, he would be the slot receiver, with Hopkins and Burks being the outside receivers. And to me, he was one of those guys based on college study. And again, you never know until they play in the league. But he always struck me as the kind of guy that could roll out of bed and be a slot receiver in the NFL. And I was really hoping that it would work out well. Now it still could. Fortunately, it doesn't sound like it's anywhere near season ending. But I was kind of looking forward to that, but we'll see.
Oh, Titans fans for sure looking forward to that. I mean, Greg, it's one game really that he truly played in. Their season opener last year against New York, but he had 9 targets. He had 6 receptions for 70 yards. Like Tannehill and him were clicking. And that's something that they've tried to use a slot receiver like that in this offense the last couple of years. Adam Humphries previously didn't pay, concussion obviously ended his time here prematurely, but they just can't seem to keep the little slot receivers healthy long enough to get them out.
And the reason I think that's interesting, and I assume that Westbrook-Ikhine will probably fill that role because he's been there, and there's familiarity not only with probably working out of the slot, which he's done, but also with Tannehill. But the thing about the slot receiver in an offense where your O-line is a work in progress at this point, we don't know until they start playing regular season games, is that slot receiver tends to be a real security blanket for a quarterback. Because sometimes the outside routes, take a little longer to develop depending on down and distance and the situation. And you feel really comfortable working inside where the receiver is often right in front of you. And those throws tend to be easier and they're just more comfortable throws and they tend to be shorter routes. How many times have we seen good slot receivers, where it's 3rd and 7 and they run an 8-yard route and you get 8 yards and you get a first down.
Yep.
So again, that's it. It doesn't mean that their offense can't work. I was just really hoping to see Kyle Phillips.
No, agreed. Well, and deployment is a question that we can't answer right now until we have some sample size of Tim Kelly with this personnel. But it is, just a curiosity to me, Greg, how they might utilize not just NWI, but we know that Tim Kelly utilized DeAndre Hopkins as a slot player a lot while he was the offensive coordinator in Houston. And I'm interested to see how they problem solve once the regular season starts, now that we know they'll be without Phillips.
One of the things that I see more and more in the league, and of course it is team specific to some degree, but you're starting to see receivers pretty much line up in multiple locations within the formation. Now, some receivers can't do that. A lot of college receivers, when they first come in the league, struggle with that because they've lined up in one spot in college and that's all they know. And, changing your splits or changing the side of your formation probably changes a lot more than people might think. And there's a lot of receivers that can't deal with that. Obviously, Hopkins, a veteran receiver, very smart, savvy, understands a lot. He can line up anywhere. And I think that's really important. I think Westbrook-Ikhine, even though, you certainly don't say, man, this guy's a top 10 receiver in the league. He's been there for a few years. He can line up in multiple spots as well. We'll see about Treylon Burks. He's only in his 2nd year. He missed a good part of his first year. He might be the guy where you have to kind of get him settled a little bit. But I think Hopkins for sure can line up in multiple locations.
Yeah, and you know, barring any setbacks, Traylon Burks looks well on his way to being available for week 1. He was back at practice on Monday and figures to be back out there when they take the field again tomorrow, as we tape this on a Wednesday. So, well, like I said, we'll have more time to talk about week 1. They did end up keeping 7 wide receivers here. The injury obviously factoring in, Greg, but Kearis Jackson and Colton Dow, the 7th-round pick, both ended up making the roster.
Yeah, were you surprised by that? I mean, you
Very.
and I talked a lot when I was down there. Of course, that was 3 weeks ago, so there was a lot more camp and more games. But I was kind of happy that Dowell made it. Again, he's a 7th-round pick. But I watched his tape coming out of Tennessee Martin, and Tennessee Martin played Boise State and Tennessee in 2022, and I thought Dowell looked good in both games. Obviously, we know he has outstanding size. You can just look at him and see that. He's got great length. The athletic testing measurables that he put up at his pro day would have been among the best of any receiver at the combine. So, you liked all that going in. I know early on in training camp, because I was there and we discussed that he struggled a bit with some drops, and I saw a few in the 2 days I was there. But, to me, just watching the tape, there was something there to work with.
An incremental improvement in training camp in the final preseason game. He led them in receptions, not end all be all, but at least progress. And, from a mindset standpoint, he had a line with us that I'm sure that he got from the coaching staff, but the idea of wanting more tackles than receptions in a preseason game because he wants to play special teams. So I think they appreciated that perspective from him, and we'll see. These things continue to evolve. It's initial 53 for a reason. God knows they're going to make transactions by the end of the day. They already have that are going to impact what yesterday's initial 53 was. But other roster cuts around the league, Greg. The Patriots decided to waive all the quarterbacks on their roster other than Mac Jones. They brought back both Bailey Zappi and Malik Cunningham out of Louisville on their practice squad. But Bailey Zappi, he played the entire game here, and I was kind of surprised, not just because they waived all the quarterbacks but Mac, but I was kind of surprised to see the Pats let him go. What does the tape tell you about Bailey Zappi?
Yeah, and I think Zappi is, in some ways, he's your classic kind of backup quarterback in the league. He probably falls into the Colton McCoy, Case Keenum mold. If everything was right, good run game, everything really good defense, and he didn't have to be the guy that led you to the victory, he can probably execute the offense. I watched him coming out of college, and there were some real positives to his game. And I know a lot of coaches thought, hey, this guy could play. And again, maybe in a different situation. You never know with guys like that are not high level in terms of physical traits. They're guys that, they play with a certain refinement to their timing, and I think Zappi is like that, but he's not a big guy. That's the other thing. He's small, so there's just a lot of things that you look at him and say, ooh, I think he's probably a backup. Now again, you need more than one quarterback, and they'll end up with more than one quarterback, but it was a little surprising because in some ways he's a lowercase Mac Jones. In a sense, you'd be running the same offense with Bailey Zappi as you do with Mac Jones.
Yeah, I'm sure it's specific to the coaching staff, Greg, but like the idea of having a backup quarterback that can run as much of your offense as humanly possible.
Right.
Like that wasn't, Malik, a different situation here last year with Ryan Tannehill, but that's always kind of an interesting thing for me to see how coaches approach that.
And it's funny you say that because there's a lot of coaches, and I've had this conversation, who feel that, and this gets to Malik Cunningham, by the way, who they also brought back on the practice squad from Louisville. And I've watched his tape, by the way, in college. And a lot of coaches, defensive coaches, say that it's really problematic if a starter were to go down and the backup can come in and run around, because you're preparing for the starter. If he's, Mac Jones is a pocket quarterback, clearly. And then all of a sudden you bring a guy in that can make plays with his legs and wants to make plays with his legs. You really have to sort of rework your defense on the fly, and that's hard to do. So, a lot of defensive coaches feel like, hey, if you bring out a guy that can move around, that makes it tough.
Yeah, without question. So speaking of moving around in a different sense, Isaiah Simmons got traded from the Cardinals to the Giants over the course of since last we met, and he was talked about coming out by a lot of talking heads as a quote unquote positionless defensive player. Now, I think that in Arizona, things have obviously gone in a way that they're retooling their roster significantly. Now in New York, he'll go to a defense that is very, very aggressive under Wink Martindale. They're going to send rushers from all over the place, and they can find a way to get him involved. What is Isaiah Simmons from a traits standpoint?
Well, first of all, I stood next to him at the combine the year he came out, and the guy looks like Tarzan. I mean, he's 6'4", 240 pounds. And, that was the thing. He's a great, great athlete. I think he ran under a 4.4, if memory serves me correctly, or right around there, and, did really well in all the athletic testing measurables. And there was a sense this guy is just an absolute stud. And, when you look at him, you kind of say, this guy's an absolute stud. But, our good buddy, Dave McGinnis, I spent a lot of time talking with him at training camp, when I was down in Nashville. And I've known Dave for 30 plus years. But, one thing I wanted to ask Coach Mack, because I'm really curious about this, and I probably knew the answer to some degree, but when you hear a coach talk about it, it resonates differently. And I said, how do you go about installing defense? He said, well, you start with your base. And you walk through your base, and then you walk through your base against every possible permutation that an offense can run. Then you go to your nickel, and you walk through your nickel against every possible thing an offense can do. And then if you're a dime team, you do the same with your dime. So the point is, Buck, is you start with your base defense, and he has to play somewhere. He's a rookie, so he's not a rookie now, but I'm saying when he is a rookie, you have to play him somewhere. You can't say, hey, Isaiah, today in our base, we're going to play you here. And then tomorrow in our base, we're going to play you here. And then the next day in our base, we're going to play you there. It doesn't work that way, and coaches know that. And I've had other conversations with coaches as well, and one in particular about Isaiah Simmons. And you have to line up in one place, and that's where you play. Now, someone might say, oh, look at Micah Parsons. He can, he played stack backer and then he played defensive end. It's a little different if a guy's going to be a pass rusher. But if you're going to be an off the ball player, let's say a linebacker, a safety, which is the way they were using Isaiah Simmons, you have to see a lot of things, and you have to be able to digest and decipher a lot of things from different levels of the defense. That's hard to do. It may not seem hard to do it, to a fan, but that's really hard to do. You have to understand, if you're a linebacker, you have to understand the run game, and you also then have to understand receiver splits and route concepts. If you're a safety, you've got to understand route concepts, but differently, because you're playing at a different level. So at some point, this idea that guys are going to play multiple positions, that doesn't fly with coaches. You've got to line up, and you've got to learn how to play a position as a rookie and play that position.
Well, and that's just, it's such a good point by you, because not only does that work, opposite of how coaches go about their jobs, but I mean, one has to think that it would disrupt a player's development if you're trying to spread them too thin, for lack of a better term.
And I don't know Isaiah Simmons, but
right.
Let's say a particular player is not overly receptive to all that. That makes it worse. But, I've never met him. He may or may not be. I couldn't answer that question. But I'm sure you remember when Miles Jack came out, another phenomenal athlete, just retired, which was a surprise to many because he's under 30. But, he came out of UCLA. You probably remember he played running back. I remember a game in his last year at UCLA. I think he carried the ball 11 times for 150 yards, had an interception on defense. Phenomenal athlete. And he came out, and people were saying, oh, he could line up on the outside. He's going to cover Julio Jones 101. And I'm thinking to myself, no, he's not going to do that. That's not going to happen. He's going to be a linebacker. And of course, he ended up being a linebacker, had some good years in the league as a linebacker. You have to play a position, and you got to learn how to play that position, because every defensive coach that I've ever talked to, there's one word that they all use. Okay. I had a wonderful opportunity to speak to Shane Bowen when I was down with you guys. Mm-hmm. And the word trust always comes up, always. And defensive coaches want players they can trust to execute whatever the assignment is, play after play after play. It's the old Belichick mantra, do your job. Because if you don't do your job on defense, if a player doesn't do his job, the issue could become a 60-yard touchdown. And that's That's obviously not what coaches are looking for. So you have to trust players to do what they're asked to do within the given defense, to execute their assignment. And for a young player, if you're asking him to play 3-4 positions, he can't learn one.
Yeah. Well, like, I think people hear stuff like Vrabel says a lot, front multiplicity. And they take that to mean that, the players obviously have versatility to them to an extent, but that versatility extends from Danico Autry playing inside as opposed to playing outside, or playing outside as opposed to inside, not, safety, pass rusher.
Right. And again, even that, not everybody can do that, because gaps change and your responsibilities within the front changes, but that's not as difficult because you're on the same level of the defense. Yeah. When you start changing levels of the defense, like people say, let's say a defensive end pass rusher coming out of college, because there's a lot of defensive ends in college who are 235 pounds, let's say. And so they come out and people say, well, he's going to have to be a linebacker, as if, oh yeah, he's going to be fine starting tomorrow. Well, now he's off the ball, and the worldview is totally different, and it's just harder. Or let's put it this way, it's different. It could be, for some, maybe it works fine, but you're seeing the game differently, and you're seeing what's in front of you differently. And that's, you got to learn that.
Yeah. ESPN put out this video. They had a camera stuck onto the front of Tua Tagovailoa's helmet in practice.
Right.
And they were showing what it is that Tua is seeing in practice. And to any person who would be put into that situation, it's your head is swimming immediately, because there's all kinds of things. It's in practice, and it's still moving 1,000 miles an hour. You have no concept of that.
I don't know if you've ever been allowed, because I know some teams, allow you, some don't, to literally stand behind a quarterback in training camp. I'm not talking about like 30 feet away. I'm talking pretty much right behind him. I've been fortunate in my career to do that. I don't know how these guys even complete a pass, much less do what they do. I mean, the bodies and the people who are bigger, because we're talking about offensive linemen and everything's moving. I mean, I had a great conversation years and years ago, and he's a good friend of mine, Steve Young. Mm-hmm. And he said, I had to learn through Bill Walsh, and he said, Bill Walsh changed my whole career, to throw the ball to a spot where I really couldn't see the receiver. I just had to throw the ball. And he said, man, was that hard to really get through my brain. And he said, once I mastered that, then he became Steve Young, Hall of Famer. But that's a hard thing.
Is there a better example of that than Tua and Mike McDaniel? Because a lot of times, Greg, and I know a lot of offenses are asking these guys to throw with timing and anticipation, throw to a spot, but Tua, it seems like, was doing that at a rate within that offense as much as any quarterback.
Well, we'll get into that another time, because there's a lot there, and I've watched a ton of Tua this offseason. I've watched a ton of guys. I've been just going crazy here watching tape. But what they do with the way they expand defenses horizontally and stretch them vertically with motions and route concepts, I'm not saying every throw is clean and right there, but they do such a great job of creating those windows for Tua that it's cleaner than most.
Well, Dolphins host the Titans on Monday Night Football a little later in the season, so I'm sure
What week is that, do you know?
That is like week 15 or 16.
Later.
Yeah.
Assuming health. I hope Tua stays healthy, because I got to tell you, that is one of the most fun offenses to watch, because of what Mike McDaniel does with what, there's more detail to than what I just said,
sure.
Getting into the weeds, and maybe we'll do that another time. But they're really a fun offense to watch.
No, I am actively rooting for their success because of how much I enjoyed watching them when he was healthy last year. Obviously, that makes a big difference, and even Teddy Bridgewater, before he had a concussion situation, was able to function in that system for a period of time. Greg, when we come back next week, we'll be talking about an actual football game, Titans and Saints, and a bunch of other games that I know we're looking forward to breaking down.
I watched a ton of Saints defense today too, so I'm already thinking ahead, Buck.
Well, good. Well, football teams don't look ahead, but we might, because it's the preseason or exhibition or whatever you want to call it. Either way, we got regular season football the next time we get together. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Greg appreciates that, as always, as we appreciate his time here with us. Thank you, buddy.
Thanks, Buck.